The courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, its stone steps already crowded with people despite the early hour. Among them was a man in his mid-30s, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit right. His name was Ray, and today wasn't going to be a good day for him. Inside, the hallways buzzed with whispers and hurried footsteps. Court was in session, and Ray's case was next on the docket. His lawyer, a public defender who looked like he hadn't slept in days, kept glancing at his watch. "Listen," the lawyer whispered, "just stay calm in there. Judge Wilson has a reputation for being fair, but she doesn't tolerate any nonsense." Ray barely nodded. His mind was elsewhere, calculating the years, potentially 20 of them, that hung over his head like a storm cloud. 20 years for a mistake he couldn't take back. 20 years that would see his kids grow up without him. When the bailiff called his case, Ray's legs felt like they were moving through mud. The courtroom was bigger than he'd expected, with high ceilings and wooden benches filled with strangers. Some were reporters with their notepads ready, others were law students observing the day's proceedings, and a few were just regular folks with nothing better to do than watch other people's misery unfold. And then there was Judge Wilson, a black woman in her 50s with a stern face and eyes that seemed to look right through you. She wore her judge's robe like armor, her back straight as she reviewed the papers in front of her. Case number 47,293, State versus Raymond Miller, charges of armed robbery with aggravating circumstances, the clerk announced, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Ray stood at the defendant's table, hands clasped in front of him to hide their shaking. His lawyer had explained what would happen today, just procedural stuff, setting dates, discussing bail. But knowing didn't make it easier. Judge Wilson looked up from her papers and studied Ray for a moment. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice neither kind nor unkind, just matter of fact. "I see this isn't your first time in my courtroom." It wasn't. 3 years ago, Ray had stood before her on a lesser charge. She'd given him a second chance then, probation instead of jail time. He'd wasted that chance, and they both knew it. "No, Your Honor," Ray replied, his voice barely audible. The prosecutor stood up then, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who never seemed to blink. "Your Honor, given the severity of the charges and the defendant's prior record, the state requests remand without bail." Ray's heart sank. No bail meant county jail until trial, which could be months away. Months in a cell while his life fell apart outside. His lawyer argued for bail, painting Ray as a family man, someone with ties to the community, not a flight risk. But his words sounded hollow even to Ray's ears. As the two lawyers went back and forth, Ray noticed something strange. Judge Wilson was watching him, not them. Her dark eyes were focused on his face, studying him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Your Honor," the prosecutor was saying, "Mr. Miller threatened the store clerk with a weapon. The security footage clearly shows." "I've reviewed the evidence, Counselor," Judge Wilson interrupted, still looking at Ray. "Mr. Miller, do you understand that you're facing up to 20 years if convicted of these charges?" The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Ray nodded, then remembered to speak. "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you understand that your actions have consequences not just for you, but for your victims, your community, and your family?" This wasn't the usual script, and Ray could see his lawyer tensing beside him. "I do, Your Honor." Judge Wilson's next words surprised everyone. "I remember you, Mr. Miller. I remembered giving you a chance. Before I make my decision on bail, I want to know why you're back in my courtroom." It was a simple question, but Ray hadn't expected it. He hadn't expected to be seen as a person rather than just another case number. As he struggled to find an answer, the packed courtroom waited, watching this unexpected exchange between a judge and the man who might spend the next 2 decades behind bars. No one knew it then, but this moment, this simple question from a judge who took the time to remember, was the first step in a story that would leave everyone speechless. The question hung in the air between them. Why was he back in her courtroom? Ray's mind raced through all the answers he could give, some true, some half-true, none that would help him now. "Life got hard, Your Honor," he finally said, his voice low but steady. "I lost my job at the warehouse. Couldn't make rent. My kids needed—" He trailed off, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. His lawyer shifted nervously beside him, probably wishing he would stop talking. Judge Wilson's expression remained unchanged. "Continue, Mr. Miller." Ray swallowed hard. "I made bad choices. Got in with some folks from my old neighborhood. One thing led to another, and he looked down at his hands. I'm not making excuses." The prosecutor cleared his throat, clearly annoyed at this unexpected turn in the proceedings. "Your Honor, while the defendant's financial difficulties are regrettable, they hardly justify armed robbery." "I'm well aware of that, Counselor," Judge Wilson replied, her tone making it clear she didn't appreciate the interruption. She turned back to Ray. "Mr. Miller, I have your file here. It tells an interesting story." She opened a folder on her bench, though Ray had the feeling she already knew what was in it by heart. "You grew up in Pine Hills. Father left when you were 7. Mother worked 2 jobs. You dropped out of high school in 11th grade. She looked up. "But what this file doesn't show is that you earned your GED while on probation. You maintained steady employment for over 2 years. You made every single meeting with your probation officer." Ray blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected her to know any of that, let alone mention it. "Then," she continued, "8 months ago, things changed. Your probation officer noted increased agitation during your meetings. You lost your job. And there were concerning statements made during your last arrest." The courtroom was silent now, everyone hanging on her words. Ray felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He knew what was coming. The arresting officer reported that you used racial slurs when you were taken into custody. Specifically, slurs directed at him and his black partner. Judge Wilson's voice remained even professional. Ray's lawyer jumped in. "Your Honor, my client was under extreme stress during his arrest." "Was the report accurate, Mr. Miller?" Judge Wilson asked, cutting off the lawyer. Ray felt trapped. The truth was ugly, but lying to her face would be worse. "Yes, Your Honor." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Wilson silenced it with a glance. "I grew up hearing that kind of talk," Ray admitted quietly. "My grandfather, my uncles, they all talked that way. I know it's not right. I'm not proud of it. Yet you used those words in a moment of stress," Judge Wilson observed. "What we say when we're under pressure often reveals what's buried within us, Mr. Miller." Ray had no response to that. She was right. The prosecutor stood again. "Your Honor, the defendant's prejudiced views only underscore the state's position that he presents a danger to the community." Judge Wilson held up a hand. "I'm capable of drawing my own conclusions, Counselor." She studied Ray for a long moment. "Mr. Miller, do you know why I remembered you specifically from 3 years ago?" Ray shook his head. "Because you were one of the few defendants who looked me in the eye when I spoke to you. Not with defiance, but with respect. It made me think there was something worth salvaging there." She closed his file. "I'm curious if that man still exists." The unexpected personal touch to her words left Ray speechless. This wasn't how judges usually talked to defendants. Most just went through the motions, another face in an endless parade of troubled souls. "Bail is set at $50,000, she announced. "If released, the defendant will wear an electronic monitor and adhere to a strict curfew." The prosecutor looked like he wanted to object but thought better of it. As the bailiff prepared to lead Ray away, Judge Wilson added, "Mr. Miller, I'll be presiding over your trial. I suggest you use this time to reflect on the path that brought you here and whether it's the one you want to continue following." As Ray was led out of the courtroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that Judge Wilson saw something in him that he'd long stopped seeing in himself. For the first time since his arrest, a tiny flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope stirred in his chest. What he didn't know was that the real test of character for both himself and Judge Wilson was still to come. 2 weeks passed. Ray's sister had somehow scraped together enough for his bail, putting up her small house as collateral. The ankle monitor rubbed his skin raw, a constant reminder of his situation. But at least he could see his kids, even if they looked at him differently now. The trial began on a Tuesday. The courthouse seemed even more imposing than before. News vans lined the street, apparently, a case like his made for good local TV. Ray kept his head down as he walked up the steps, his lawyer chattering nervously beside him. "Remember what we talked about," the lawyer said. "Just sit quietly. Don't react to anything. The jury will be watching you the whole time." The courtroom was packed tighter than before. Ray spotted his sister in the back row, her face tight with worry. He wanted to thank her again for the bail money, but the bailiff was already calling the court to order. Judge Wilson entered, and everyone stood. She looked the same as before, composed, professional, her judge's robe perfectly pressed. But there was something in her eyes today. Worriness, perhaps, like she was preparing for battle. The prosecutor's opening statement painted Ray as a career criminal who'd squandered his second chances. He described the robbery in vivid detail, the store clerk's fear, the gun in Ray's hand, the threats he'd allegedly made. With each word, Ray felt smaller in his chair, more monstrous. His lawyer's response felt weak in comparison. Talk of circumstantial evidence, of reasonable doubt, of a man driven by desperation rather than malice. Ray could see from the jury's faces that they weren't buying it. Then came the witnesses. First, the store clerk, a thin, nervous man who pointed at Ray with a slightly shaking finger. "That's him. He's the one who put the gun in my face." Ray's lawyer tried to poke holes in his story on cross-examination, but the clerk stayed firm. Next was the store owner, who described the damage to his business, both physical and emotional. Then a customer who'd been in the back of the store during the robbery. With each testimony, Ray felt the noose tightening. His lawyer had warned him the first day would be rough, that the prosecution always front-loaded their strongest evidence. But knowing didn't make it any easier to bear. After lunch, they'd brought in the police officer who'd arrested Ray. Officer Chen was a veteran cop with a straight back and clear eyes. He described finding Ray hiding in an abandoned building 3 blocks from the store, still holding the cash and the weapon. "And what was the defendant's demeanor when you apprehended him?" the prosecutor asked. Officer Chen glanced at Ray. He was agitated, combative. "Did he say anything to you during the arrest?" Chen shifted in his seat. "He did." "Can you tell the court what he said?" Ray's lawyer stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance." "I'm establishing the defendant's state of mind at the time of arrest," the prosecutor countered. Judge Wilson considered for a moment. "I'll allow it, but tread carefully, counselor." Officer Chen cleared his throat. "The defendant used racial slurs, directed at both myself and my partner." "What specifically did he say?" the prosecutor pressed. Judge Wilson interrupted. "The general nature of the comments has been established. We don't need the specific language repeated in this courtroom." Ray felt a flash of gratitude toward her, though he knew she was just doing her job. The prosecutor nodded. "Officer Chen, in your experience, do suspects typically become more or less truthful when agitated?" "Objection calls for speculation," Ray's lawyer said. "Sustained," Judge Wilson replied. The prosecutor pivoted smoothly. "Officer Chen, during this arrest, did the defendant at any point claim he was innocent?" "No, sir, he did not." By the time court adjourned for the day, Ray felt hollowed out. The weight of his actions, the evidence against him, the faces of the jury, it was all too much. As everyone began filing out, he remained seated, staring at his hands. Judge Wilson was gathering her papers when she glanced his way. Their eyes met briefly across the emptying courtroom. There was no sympathy in her gaze, but no judgment either, just a clear-eyed assessment that made Ray feel exposed to his core. Tomorrow would be worse. Tomorrow they would show the security footage. And Ray knew with a sick certainty that once the jury saw what he'd done, any hope of leniency would vanish like smoke. What he didn't know was that tomorrow would change everything, in ways no one in that courtroom could possibly predict. The second day of the trial dawned cold and gray. Rain pattered against the courthouse windows as people filed in, shaking off umbrellas and wiping fogged glasses. Ray sat at the defense table, his cheap suit feeling tighter than yesterday. He hadn't slept. Dark circles hung under his eyes, making him look even more guilty. His lawyer leaned over. "They're showing the security footage today. Just prepare yourself." As if he could. Ray nodded anyway, his mouth too dry to speak. Judge Wilson entered the courtroom, her presence commanding instant silence. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Today the judge seemed more watchful, her eyes moving between Ray, the jury, and the growing tension in the room. The prosecutor stood, smooth and confident. "Your Honor, the state would like to present State's Exhibit 15, security footage from the convenience store on the night in question." A court officer wheeled in a TV on a stand. The lights dimmed. Ray stared at his hands, unable to watch himself on screen, knowing what was coming. The footage played. There was no sound, but none was needed. The images were clear enough. Ray entering the store, pulling out a gun, pointing it at the clerk. His face contorted with anger as he shouted demands. The terrified clerk emptying the register. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Ray could feel the jury's eyes burning into him. As you can see, the prosecutor said, pausing the video at a particularly damning moment, the defendant's actions were deliberate and threatening. He played more footage, Ray grabbing the money, backing toward the door, still pointing the gun. Then it happened. On screen, a customer walked in. An elderly man who'd picked the wrong moment for a late-night snack. The man froze upon seeing the gun. Ray on screen seemed to panic, waving the weapon, shouting something at the old man. The customer raised his hands, backing away. The prosecution would like to call Mr. Henderson to the stand, the prosecutor announced. The elderly man from the video shuffled forward. After being sworn in, he settled into the witness chair, adjusting his hearing aid. Mr. Henderson, can you identify the person who threatened you that night? The old man pointed at Ray without hesitation. That's him right there. And can you tell the court what the defendant said to you? Mr. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. He told me to get on the ground, said he'd shoot if I moved. Did he say anything else? The old man hesitated, glancing at Judge Wilson. He used some ugly words, called me names. What kind of names, sir? Ray's lawyer jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. Prejudicial. Your Honor, the prosecutor countered, this goes to the defendant's state of mind and establishes a pattern of behavior. Judge Wilson considered for a moment. I'll allow it, but again, be mindful of the specific language in my courtroom. The old man looked down at his hands. He used racial slurs. Called me an old. Well, I won't repeat it, but it was because I'm black. The courtroom tensed. A juror in the front row. A black woman in her 40s, visibly stiffened. Thank you, Mr. Henderson, the prosecutor said, looking satisfied. Ray's lawyer stood for cross-examination, but the damage was done. Whatever questions he asked only seemed to make things worse. As the morning wore on, Ray felt himself shrinking, becoming smaller with each piece of evidence. His past mistakes, his prejudices, his failures, all laid bare for strangers to judge. After the lunch break, the prosecutor called his final witness, a former cellmate of Ray's from a previous stint in county jail. The man smirked as he took the stand, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. He told me he hated taking orders from black people, the cellmate testified. Said he couldn't stand having a black judge for his case. Ray's fists clenched under the table. That was a lie. He'd never said that. Objection, his lawyer called. Hearsay. Your Honor, this speaks to the defendant's character and motives, the prosecutor argued. Before Judge Wilson could rule, something in Ray snapped. The pressure, the lies, the hopelessness, it all became too much. That's not true, he shouted, jumping to his feet. He's lying. Mr. Miller, be seated, Judge Wilson ordered, her voice sharp. But Ray was beyond hearing. Weeks of fear and anger burst forth like a broken dam. This whole thing is rigged. You're all against me from the start. His eyes locked on Judge Wilson, especially you. The courtroom froze. In the sudden silence, the weight of what he'd done crashed down on Ray. The bailiffs moved toward him quickly. Judge Wilson's face was unreadable as she spoke. Remove the jury. No one could have predicted what would happen next. As the jury filed out, you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. Ray stood frozen, the reality of what he'd just done washing over him like ice water. His lawyer had his face in his hands. The prosecutor looked like he'd just won the lottery. The bailiffs flanked Ray, waiting for the judge's order to take him away. Judge Wilson sat perfectly still, her expression carefully blank. When the door closed behind the last juror, she spoke, her voice controlled. Mr. Miller, you are in contempt of court. Ray swallowed hard. That could mean more jail time on top of whatever he'd get for the robbery. Your Honor, my client apologizes for his outburst, his lawyer began, standing quickly. The stress of the trial is not an excuse for such behavior, Judge Wilson finished for him. She looked directly at Ray. Bailiffs, please escort everyone out of the courtroom except for the defendant, his attorney, and the prosecutor. Murmurs erupted as people were led out. Ray's sister caught his eye as she left, her face a mixture of disappointment and worry. When the room was nearly empty, Judge Wilson stood. I'm calling a 1-hour recess. When we return, Mr. Miller, you will have composed yourself, or you will watch the remainder of your trial from a holding cell via video link. Is that understood? Ray nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Clear the courtroom, she ordered, then disappeared through the door behind her bench. The bailiffs led Ray to a small conference room rather than a cell. His lawyer paced back and forth, muttering about mistrials and appeals. The prosecutor stood in the corner, arms crossed, looking smug. We're finished, the lawyer told Ray. That outburst just sealed your fate. The jury will hear about it, and they'll. The door opened, cutting him off. Judge Wilson entered alone, without her robe, wearing a simple black suit. Both lawyers stood immediately. Your Honor, this is highly unusual, the prosecutor started. So is this entire case, she replied. I'd like to speak with Mr. Miller. Alone. The lawyers exchanged glances. That's not protocol, the prosecutor argued. Neither is what I'm considering, she said. 10 minutes, gentlemen. Wait outside. Reluctantly, they left. Ray sat at the conference table, heart hammering in his chest, as Judge Wilson took a seat across from him. This conversation is off the record, she said. Nothing you say here will be used in court. Do you understand? Ray nodded, confused. Good. She folded her hands on the table. Tell me why you robbed that store. What? Not the excuse you gave your lawyer or the story you rehearsed. The truth. Ray stared at her, trying to figure out her angle. Was this some kind of trap? I'll lose either way, he finally said. What's the point? The point, Mr. Miller, is that I'm trying to understand something. She leaned forward slightly. I've been a judge for 15 years. I can usually spot a career criminal from 1,000 yards. But you don't quite fit the profile. So I'm giving you one chance to tell me why a man who worked steadily for 2 years, who got his GED, who made every probation meeting, suddenly decided to rob a convenience store with a gun. The directness of her question caught him off guard. He'd expected lecture, not curiosity. My boy got sick, Ray said finally, the words coming out rough. Cancer. Doctors said he needed special treatments our insurance wouldn't cover. I tried everything. Extra jobs, loans, even begging my boss for an advance. Nothing worked. He looked down at his hands. I was desperate. Then I ran into an old friend who said he knew an easy way to get cash. Had a gun I could borrow. Judge Wilson's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Your son's illness isn't mentioned anywhere in your file. His mom and I split up years ago. She has custody. I send what I can. Ray shook his head. I'm not asking for pity. What I did was wrong. I scared innocent people. I could have hurt someone, but I wasn't thinking straight. And the racial slurs, the anger, are those also things you do when you're not thinking straight? Ray flinched at the question. I grew up with that stuff. When I get scared or angry, it just comes out. It's like a reflex. He met her eyes. I know that's not an excuse. No, she agreed. It's not. She studied him for a long moment. Ray had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing right through him, past all his defenses and excuses. Mr. Miller, I'm about to do something unconventional. Something that might help both of us understand what justice really means. Ray didn't know what to say to that. But for the first time since his arrest, he felt a flicker of hope that someone was actually seeing him, the whole person, not just his worst moments. What Judge Wilson did next would change both their lives forever. When court resumed, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone had heard about Ray's outburst. Spectators whispered among themselves, wondering what would happen next. The jury filed in, their faces carefully neutral, though their curious glances toward Ray gave away their thoughts. Judge Wilson took a seat, composed as ever. Before we continue with the state's case, I have a matter to address. She looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with several people. I've spent the recess considering an unusual approach to these proceedings. The prosecutor straightened in his chair. Your Honor. Mr. Miller's outburst, while unacceptable, has highlighted something important. She folded her hands on the bench. This case involves more than just an armed robbery. It touches on deeper issues that a standard trial might not fully address. Ray sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. His lawyer looked confused, shooting him questioning glances that Ray couldn't answer. "I am invoking my judicial discretion to pause the standard trial proceedings," Judge Wilson announced. "Instead, we will transition to a restorative justice approach for the next portion of this case." A buzz swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. The state has the right to complete its case against the defendant." "You will have that opportunity, Counselor," Judge Wilson assured him. "But first, I want to try something different." She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, your service is vital. What I'm about to ask is unusual, but I believe it serves the interests of true justice." She explained that restorative justice focuses on repairing harm caused by crime by involving all affected parties: offender, victims, and community members. The jury would observe, but not deliberate until the process was complete. "The store clerk, Mr. Henderson, and other affected parties have agreed to participate," she said. Ray couldn't believe what he was hearing. His lawyer leaned over, whispering frantically, "Don't say anything. This could either save you or sink you completely." Judge Wilson continued, "Mr. Miller will have the opportunity to directly address those he harmed. They, in turn, will tell him how his actions affected them. This isn't about excusing criminal behavior, it's about understanding its full impact." The prosecutor was still standing. "Your Honor, the defendant has shown contempt for this court. He's demonstrated racial bias. Rewarding his outburst with this alternative approach sends the wrong message." "I'm not rewarding anyone, Counselor," Judge Wilson replied, her voice firm. "I'm seeking the most effective path to justice. Sometimes that means trying something new when the traditional approach fails." She turned to Ray. "Mr. Miller, are you willing to participate honestly in this process? To truly listen to those you've harmed and speak truthfully about your actions?" All eyes turned to him. Ray felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about avoiding prison, it was about something deeper. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I am." "Very well." She addressed the room. "Court will reconvene tomorrow morning in a restorative justice chamber. It's a smaller room, more suitable for this process. Space for observers will be limited." As people began filing out, Ray noticed something strange. The store clerk was looking at him not with anger, but with curiosity. Mr. Henderson, the elderly customer, nodded slightly in his direction. And Judge Wilson, for just a moment, gave him a look that wasn't sympathy exactly, but something like recognition, as if she saw in him not just the man who'd committed a crime, but someone capable of change. That night, in his sister's spare bedroom, Ray lay awake for hours. Tomorrow he would face the people he terrorized, not from across a courtroom, but across a table. He'd have to look them in the eye, with no lawyer to speak for him, no script to follow. He was terrified. But for the first time since his arrest, he also felt something else, a chance to be seen as more than just his worst mistake. Whether that chance would lead to redemption or deeper punishment remained to be seen. 5 years later, the same courthouse stood against a clear blue sky. Inside, a different kind of hearing was taking place. The restorative justice chamber, once an experiment, was now a permanent fixture, its walls lined with artwork made by former offenders. Ray walked through the security checkpoint, nodding to the guard who recognized him. He wasn't wearing handcuffs or an ankle monitor. His cheap suit had been replaced by clean, pressed khakis and a buttoned-down shirt. The dark circles under his eyes were gone, replaced by a steadiness that hadn't been there before. He arrived early, sitting in the empty chamber alone with his thoughts. The last 5 years played through his mind like scenes from someone else's life. That first restorative justice session had nearly broken him. Sitting across from the store clerk, seeing up close the trauma in the man's eyes, hearing how he'd had nightmares for months after the robbery. It was harder than any punishment the justice system could have devised. Mr. Henderson, the elderly customer, had spoken about feeling helpless, about how race slurs had cut deeper than the fear of the gun. "You made me feel less than human," he'd said quietly. "Like my 70 years on this earth meant nothing." Ray had no excuses left that day. All he could offer was the truth and a promise to do better. A promise that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Yet Judge Wilson had seen something worth saving. Her sentence had been unprecedented. 3 years in prison instead of 20, followed by intensive rehabilitation, regular community service in the neighborhood he terrorized, and ongoing restorative meetings with those he harmed. "This isn't leniency," she told the packed courtroom when she announced her decision. "This is accountability with purpose." The door opened, interrupting Ray's thoughts. Judge Wilson entered, no longer in her robes, but dressed in a simple blazer and slacks. Her hair had a few more gray strands than 5 years ago. "Mr. Miller," she said, offering a small smile. "Right on time." More people filtered in, the store clerk, now the manager, Mr. Henderson, walking more slowly but standing just as tall, Ray's sister and his son, now cancer-free, community members who'd been part of the restorative circle, even the prosecutor who'd initially fought the approach but had gradually become one of its strongest advocates. This was Ray's final review hearing. After 5 years of what Judge Wilson called earned redemption, today would determine if his probation would end completely. One by one, people spoke about the changes they'd witnessed. The store clerk described how Ray had helped him install security upgrades in the shop. Mr. Henderson talked about their weekly chess games at the community center Ray now helped run. Ray's former boss spoke about his reliable work as a maintenance supervisor. When it was Ray's turn to speak, he stood slowly, taking a deep breath. 5 years ago, I stood in a courtroom full of hate for others, hate for myself. I thought my life was over. His voice was steady, clear. Judge Wilson saw past that hate to the person I could become. She didn't excuse what I did. She made me face it head-on every day with the people I hurt. He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. I can never undo what I did. But I've tried to live these past 5 years honoring the chance I was given. Not just for myself, but for my son, for this community, and for everyone who believed change was possible. Judge Wilson nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful. The purpose of justice isn't just punishment, she said. It's restoration, healing, growth. She looked directly at Ray. You've done the work, Mr. Miller. Your probation is officially ended. The room broke into applause. As people gathered around him with handshakes and even a few hugs, Ray caught Judge Wilson's eye across the crowd. There was a moment of understanding between them, an acknowledgement of how far they'd both come. What had started as a case of hatred and violence had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. Not just one man's redemption, but a ripple effect that changed an entire community's understanding of what justice could be. Sometimes the most powerful change begins in the most unlikely place. A courtroom where a judge chose compassion over contempt, and a defendant found the courage to become more than his worst mistake.